Hello and welcome back to WTF is SRE. I hope you did well on that quiz. Next up, we have an amazing talk about lions, tigers, and oh, no, that's not right. Alyssa, I'm going to hand it over to you because you know what the talk's about. I don't. Take it away, Alyssa.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nathan. And hey, everybody, how are you? So yeah, we're not talking lions and tigers and bears. We're talking pasta, octave, and stride, and probably a few other things that you've heard about threat modeling that just kind of oftentimes make people cringe. So I'm going to try to bring us out of that cringeworthy woods and let's talk about how threat modeling really helps make our lives better. Makes things easier for us. How can it be an effective tool for us? But I'm going to kick things off just by telling you a little bit about me, because here I am sitting here talking at you. I should probably let you know who I am in case you don't know. First of all, I'm a hacker. I have been all my life. I'm a security researcher and a security advocate. I like to share my ideas, hear what other people are saying, and see how we can get better. I am the BISO, or Business Information Security Officer, for S&P Global Ratings. If you don't know what that is, I will give you a link to my blog later where you can read about what a BISO is and what it is that I do. But I am an author and a blogger. I'm currently working on my first book. I blog on my website. I've blogged on behalf of organizations I've worked for. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Uncommon Journey. So, former developer, been in security for 16 years. That's where I'm coming from. Now, let's talk about that development world for a minute, because it's changed a lot in the last 10 years. This little thing we call the cloud came up, right? And how many of you have seen this picture before? This is the technologies map from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And this one is, I think, 4 or 5 months old that I took this screenshot. And you can see already, I mean, this full blown, I can load it on that 36-inch monitor behind me, and I still can't read this if I make it full screen. You have to really zoom in. It's huge. We have all this complexity. And for those of you that are SREs, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Our engineering teams are throwing all these new technologies at us, and they're saying, hey, you got to support this. And, oh, security folks, you got to make it secure for us. And that's really not the DevOps way. That's not what we're trying to do. DevSecOps is supposed to be we're all working together towards this shared responsibility to make it better and to make it, that we're all collaboratively trying to make our software stable. We're trying to get it to production quickly, and we want it to be secure. So then our security people come in, and people like me say, you should threat model. Threat modeling makes it easier. But when I say threat modeling, people kind of think of stuff like this, right? We think of drawing big DFD diagrams and methodologies like stride and pasta and octave. And then we think about dread and CAPAC and all these things. And we always think about threat modeling is basically this heavy lift. It's too slow. We can't do it in a DevOps world. It doesn't fit. So Alyssa, what are you talking about? How are we going to make threat modeling part of our pipeline and help make things better? What are we going to do? So yeah, that's the problem with that thinking, right? That thinking is so 2008, because before 2008, we didn't know what DevOps was. It wasn't a thing. But then Patrick Dubois and Andrew Schaefer got together and they created this thing we now know as DevOps. And suddenly we were breaking down barriers between the dev teams and the ops teams. And we were working together. Those silos were gone. We were trying to get faster and faster and faster in our deploys. And security kind of was on the outside. We didn't really think about security in terms of DevOps until about 2012. But, the fact is, these big, huge, heavy lifting, we need big design cycles so we can draw up these data flow diagrams and whatnot. That just doesn't work with this idea of DevOps. When we're trying to implement CI/CD pipelines, we don't necessarily even have a big design cycle where we can map out our entire system and talk about all the threats it's going to face. But that's okay, because I'm here to tell you right now, threat modeling is something that will make your lives easier, and I'm going to show you how. But in order to show you how, I've got to get you back to basics. What is threat modeling, and why the heck do we even want to do it? So, I started thinking about this a couple of years ago, And because I've always had a passion for threat modeling, but threat modeling in DevOps is always this problem. And so it's like, well, if I want to get threat modeling into DevOps, I got to reshape it. I got to reshape what it is. I gotta show it in a new way and bring it to us in a different way. So I got to think about what's important, and that means getting back to basics. So step one, what is threat modeling? Well, I went on, did some Googling. I started with OWASP. If you're familiar with the Open Web Application Security Project, you know that they're kind of the definitive source when it comes to anything AppSec related. This was their description of threat modeling. This isn't the simple what is threat modeling answer I was looking for. This is pretty complex. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see how long it is. You can see it focuses on really technical things like DOS attacks and failure of storage devices and all these things. And for a lot of us, that's not helpful. So I moved on. Wikipedia is great. If it's in Wikipedia, it's true. So I can trust Wikipedia, right? But this wasn't that simple back to basics answer. Like, this is so complex. Who's even going to read this, let alone digest what this actually means in terms of something that their security team wants them to do in their DevOps pipeline? This isn't going to happen. So then it hit me. I got to just thinking about it. Like, what do we really do when we're threat modeling? And I started thinking outside of IT for a minute, because threat modeling is something we all do on a daily basis. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But so I thought about it. I'm like, how do I just put this in simple terms? At its very core, threat modeling is simply asking the question, what could possibly go wrong? My good friend Timmy Turner gets it. Maybe he wasn't very good at threat modeling, but he understood what the concept was. Threat modeling is nothing more than looking at the scope or the context in which some system we want to threat model and ask ourselves, what could possibly go wrong here? So then it hit me. All right, here it is. This is a good definition. It's simple. It's straight to the point. Threat modeling is just identifying those likely threats to a system so that we can inform the design of our security countermeasures. Unfortunately, I didn't find that definition. I actually had to write it myself. So great, I've got a definition. But as it turns out, I wasn't the only one in our industry struggling with this idea of how do we get back to the basics with threat modeling, help people understand why it's so valuable to them and how they bring it into their DevOps environment. So last year, I believe June timeframe, me and 14 others in the security space got together and we formed a working group. And that working group set out to form and to write and to publish the Threat Modeling Manifesto, to define what threat modeling truly is at its core, why it's important, and how to do it the right way. So we published that manifesto in November of last year, and you've got the link down here. It's just threatmodelingmanifesto.org. Go check it out in your free time. I encourage you to do that. But this was ultimately the definition we came up with. And you can see it's not all that much different from the one I just gave you that I had come up with the year before. It probably has something to do with the fact I was part of this working group and I was able to influence it. And I think we all agreed that this is really what threat modeling is about, analyzing different representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. That's what we do when we threat model. Okay. But why? Why do I want to do that? Why is that important to me? Especially as, if I'm an SRE and my goal is really, I've got to think about my production environment. Why do I care about threat modeling? What does threat modeling do to make my life easier? My experience with threat modeling is I got to sit down. I got to go into these big meetings with a bunch of people. We got to draw up all these different architecture diagrams and data flow diagrams and attack trees. And we're going to sit down and talk for hours and hours and hours over a course of days and weeks. And then we're going to come up with a list of threats. And then what? What do I do with that information? Where does it go? What did I accomplish through all of that? And indeed, that's a lot of people's typical experience with threat modeling. And it's why threat modeling, especially in DevOps, doesn't happen. But I told you before, there's a reason that as Whether you're a developer, whether you're in operations, you're an SRE, whether you're in security, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, threat modeling makes our lives easier. So why do I want to do it? Well, in 2019, Puppet and Circle CI, you probably recognize those two names, especially if you're in a DevOps culture. They got together and they did their 2019 State of DevOps report. And one of the things they looked at was security practices. And they mapped them out in terms of how common or how often those practices are executed versus the impact that those practices have on the security posture of our software. Now, so in the upper left, you see those practices that we do often. They're very common. They're executed quite regularly within our pipelines, but they don't drive as much impact, we'll say. So up there, you see static code analysis and penetration testing and dependency checkers and security requirements. All of those things we're so used to having to do, and we do them a lot. But we see that, yeah, the impact of them maybe isn't giving us as much as we need. But it's when I look in this lower right quadrant, the ones that maybe we don't do enough of, but have the biggest impact. What do I see there? Security and dev, and we can include our ops and SREs there as well, collaborating on threat models. Now we're starting to see the picture why threat modeling is important. So far, at least from a security perspective, threat modeling gives us great bang for the buck. But why does it have that? Why is it so helpful to us? Why does it impact our security posture? How does it do that for us? So we're going to get there. Within the threat modeling manifesto, we worded it a little differently. The output of the threat model informs the decisions that you make in subsequent design, development, testing, and deployment phases. So think about that for a minute. I'm telling you right now that threat modeling impacts your entire pipeline from design through post-deployment. Think about the possibilities here for a minute. Now we start to see why, okay, this makes sense. We're informing those decisions that we're going to make along the way by understanding the threats. So how does this fit? How is this making my life as an SRE easier? Well, let's look at this for a minute. Now, traditional threat modeling, as I said before, we wanted to identify threat information, but we traditionally do it, it's in like a design phase. So we've already got our sprint planned. We know what we're trying to implement. We need to draw up a design. How many of you do that in your DevOps environments? Do you have those long design phases where you sit for a few weeks and you design everything that you're going to create in your next sprint? Probably not. Your sprint probably doesn't even last that long in most cases. If you're CI/CD, there is no idea of a sprint and design. It's all continuous. We're in a constant flow. So how do I change this paradigm, and how do I make it help me as a developer, as a security person, as an operations person? How do I make this better? We push that threat information all the way back to the user story. Think about it. When I write a user story, it doesn't actually really matter how long it takes me to write that story in terms of my pipeline. My pipeline hasn't begun yet at the point I'm writing a user story. So if I can put this threat modeling information in there, I've got it as far left as I can push. Have you heard that push left story before? I've pushed as far left as I can possibly go. And what if I take that threat modeling information, I take things like Stride and Pasta and Octave and all that, I throw it out the window. Forget about it. I'm telling you, forget about it. Throw those frameworks away. You don't need them. I sound like a pitch person right now. Forget all that. You don't need that. You throw away your mops and I'm going to sell you this cool new thing, right? But no, the reality is you don't need them. What you need to understand are two things. To get the threat information in there, you need to understand what are the critical assets in the context of that user story. Is there personally identifiable or private information that you have to defend against or you have to protect? Is the functionality of that user story something that's critical, that has to be available at all times? And that's your critical asset. Maybe your critical asset are trade secrets or other transactions that could be attacked in some way. Once you understand what those assets are, what's important to you, now you can understand the threats. Is there a threat of something being stolen, of fraud being committed, of the system being made not available and your inability to deliver a critical service? That's all plain language that anybody can understand. I'm not talking about spoofing and tampering and repudiation like we see in Stride. I'm talking about things that anybody who's involved in my entire pipeline, even the business folks who write my user stories, can understand and articulate that information. And in fact, those business people, they have the best context for identifying what's critical in terms of the assets. And I'm talking business assets, not IT assets, and how it could be attacked. So I take that threat information, I put that in my user story. Now, whether I'm doing a formal planning cycle or I'm just a dev who's taking another user story off the pile or the backlog and I'm going to do it, I can start to think about security requirements. When I start coding, I can build security controls into my code and I can document these back to the user story when I'm done. Then I can use that information when I build my test cases, and I can actually automate my test cases off my user story based on the threat information that I have, the asset information I have, the security controls information I have. And now for my SREs, here's the best one. We got to worry about monitoring and things like that. I know what I have to monitor. I know what to prioritize. I know how to monitor. I know what I'm looking for from a security perspective. So I can work with my security teams to make sure the monitoring that we have in place in our environment meets the needs that we have to defend that. But how do we build a methodology for this type of threat modeling? That's what the threat modeling manifesto set out to accomplish. We didn't want to define a whole framework like Stride, Pasta, Octave, all those things. We just wanted to set it up because we understood the importance that threat modeling has to align with an organization's development practices. It's got to fit your org. So the organization themselves needs to build that methodology, but we wanted to help guide that process. So we defined the practices, the values, and the patterns and anti-patterns of good threat modeling and not so good threat modeling. So let's talk about those values. Let's start with the first one, a culture of finding and fixing design issues over checkbox compliance. I love this picture because it's a perfect illustration of checkbox compliance, right? Hey, we know we have to have a parking space labeled for those who have some form of special accommodations need. Well, my problem is, sure, you marked a spot, and then who the heck can park there? And we do this from a security perspective. And when we think about threat modeling, so often threat modeling becomes just this thing that we do to check a box, but we don't gain any value from it. The same way that marking this area as a handicap spot, as we call it here in the US, serves no value to anybody because nobody can ever park there. So what have we done? We've checked the box. So when we think about threat modeling, we have to be focused on building a culture of fixing and finding design issues. That's what threat modeling is there for. It's to inform our decisions as we go through the development process. Next, people and collaboration. Oh, there's that word again. I said it. Collaboration. Where did we see that before? Oh, yeah, on that quadrant map from Puppet and Circle CI, right? Collaboration is so key. If I want to build a culture, like we said in our first value, I need to focus on people and collaboration over processes, tools, and methodologies. This is why we didn't define a methodology. This is why I won't stand here and tell you you should buy a certain tool to do threat modeling. In fact, it's why I'm going to tell you you shouldn't rely on a tool alone. Yes, we want to automate all the things in our pipelines, right? That's what we do. Automate everything. But the reality is threat modeling's value comes from the collaboration that goes across those silos that we're trying to break down. So it fits perfect with DevOps and what we're trying to do because it's about getting all of those teams working together. And this is so crucial. That collaboration is where we find the value. We build that culture of value or that culture of finding and fixing issues, gaining real value from the threat modeling. So this is just building on that previous practice. And then we move on. It's a journey of understanding. And that word journey is important. Now, in in our talks and building the threat modeling manifesto, we were very deliberate in our terminology. Threat modeling is not something you do once and you're done. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. It's a journey of understanding. It's not a security snapshot. So often when we threat model, we do it once, boom, it's done. And okay, great. Again, going back to that checkbox idea, we check the box, we're done. We don't have to think about the threat model anymore. No, it has to be a journey. We're sitting down and we're talking with each other. We're sharing information. Maybe we don't have those meetings because we are in a high-paced CI/CD environment, but we're finding ways to share that information, to collaborate, and we're constantly exchanging that information. So we're growing and constantly understanding our system in a whole new light. With each user story that we threat model, we gain greater awareness of the critical assets, the threats, how we can define security controls. We start to see the commonality of security controls, and those become things that turn into reference architectures that we use down the road. That journey of understanding, continually understanding greater scope of our systems, is where we find value in threat modeling. So then there's this idea of doing threat modeling. Do it over just talking about it. If I'm building a methodology for threat modeling, I can't just talk about threat modeling. I can't just talk about all the things and all the threat. I need to actually get down and do it. I've got to not just get into the door of that airplane. I've got to jump. I've got my parachute. I'm ready to go. I got to take that step out of the door of the airplane, jump, and I'm going for it. All too often in our organizations, when we talk about threat modeling, we never really truly sit down and understand what it is and actually do it. And that is a crucial failure that we need to overcome. So when we talk about in the manifesto, doing threat modeling over talking about it, we're talking about putting it into action. And maybe we start small. Maybe we start simply. We only consider a few threats. But it's far better to implement a small and very narrow focused methodology than to sit and talk about it for 8 months and never actually implement anything. We got to get there. We got to start doing it today, because that leads into our last practice, which is continuous refinement over a single delivery. When we're talking about threat modeling, it's got to be this idea of what I call the other CI. So we know CI and CD, they're continuous integration, continuous deployment. What about continuous improvement? It's talked about once in a while. We think about it in terms of our pipeline sometimes. Like we watch the metrics and we say, how fast are we deploying? Are we doing X number of deploys a day? We have a goal. We want our pipeline to be fast enough that we're doing maybe 10 deploys a week or something like that. And we look at that and we look at ways to get better. We need to be doing that with our threat modeling. It needs to be a part of that process. How do we continue to make our threat models better? So if we started small because we wanted to make sure we started doing something, now we continue to grow that. We start to look at new ways to identify threats, new ways. Maybe we don't automate those test cases right away. We just use them. We use the threat information to prioritize existing test cases. So maybe that becomes our next step. We move towards automation. Maybe we're really excited and ambitious, and we're going to go after leveraging artificial intelligence or machine learning to make our threat modeling better, or to leverage it better in terms of design. Maybe we're going to go after what I mentioned before, that idea of reference architectures. And how do I build engineering standards off of all this threat information I've gathered so that I know where my devs need the most help? I know where my SREs need better visibility into what's going on and what they need to be doing to ensure that our sites are stable and that we're delivering with efficiency and that our customers are happy. This is where the rubber meets the road, constantly working to get better. It's not just doing one threat model, throwing it out there and, okay, this is how we do threat modeling, is the way we're going to do it forever. No, we're constantly refining that methodology, looking for new ways to improve so we can gain those efficiencies within our pipelines. We can use threat modeling to make our lives easier and to improve our overall maturity in our DevSecOps culture. So it's just about time for me to wrap up already. This has been wonderful. I hope that you've gotten some useful information from it. I want to leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein. Genius is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. For far too long, threat modeling has been the latter. It has been taking these simple ideas and doing all these complex things. Keep it simple, stupid. Focus on simplicity and just continuous improvement with your threat modeling. Now, if you want to keep the conversation going or you want to talk to me about other things, like I said, I'm an advocate. I love talking security. I love talking DevSecOps. I love talking about how we get better. I love hearing other people's ideas and having people challenge mine, quite frankly. You can follow me on the socials. You see Twitter. That's the easiest way. LinkedIn, if that's your preference. My website, you can go check out that blog about what a BISO is if you're really curious to know what it is that I do on a daily basis and what BISO even means. Go check it out. Finally, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your time and attention and participation. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you to our conference organizers. I can't appreciate being invited to be a part of this today. I can't express enough how important that is to me. And then finally, of course, to my organization, S&P Global, thank you for giving me the time to actually be here today and supporting me in this. So with that, I'm going to open it up. I'll turn it back to our host and we'll open it up for some questions.
All right. Hey, thank you so much, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Hopefully there was some value in there for some people and maybe we see how threat modeling fits a little better.
I'm sure there's a lot of value. I'm really excited. Thank you so much. Thanks for that talk and for all the information. There's been some great comments as well. We don't have any questions, but people are just saying how great the talk was and how much they enjoyed it. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, good. I must have done my job. If there's no questions, that means they understood what I was saying.
Well, I'm sure they understood, but it looks like Drew is in with a question for you, Alyssa. So,
there we go.
So, Carrie, do you want to read the question for Alyssa?
Yeah, sure. So Drew's asked, with overworked software teams, how do you get a few members to show up for collaboration?
So collaboration doesn't have to be a meeting, right? I mean, if you think about what do we already do today in terms of our development process? We do sprint planning, right? We sit down, maybe we have those meetings, or maybe we do daily stand-ups. We've got our retros. Those are all opportunities to share that threat information, especially if we're putting it into the user story when it hits the backlog. If we're really, really super fast in our CI/CD cycles and we just got devs pulling stuff straight off the backlog and maybe it's already stack ranked and prioritized there. Okay. You have that information in there and that provides a level of collaboration. You know who wrote that. So if you have questions as a dev, you know who to go back to find out more information about that threat. If you need help designing security controls, you have those people embedded in from the security side because you're DevSecOps. Hopefully that's part of your culture. You can make those things happen and it shouldn't add more friction. If anything, it should be removing some of that friction from your development process.
It's a valid point. That's really awesome. I think that vision is really great to have, know where we're heading towards.
Definitely.
There's
I really love
more
the
praise coming through. Just mentioning.
I love the other thing that you said there, Alyssa, about well, two things actually. It's about continuous improvement, but also the key thing, I think, it's not about talking about continuous improvement. It's about doing it. It's about putting these practices and these ideas into work. And I think that the truth is, and the experience I've seen is that many teams can talk about these things theoretically and understand the concepts, but don't really get that foundational understanding until you try putting these ideas into work. So do you have any advice for folks that are just getting started with some of these ideas? How do we do this? How do we start small?
So again, think about what I said as far as like threats in terms of plain language. You do that. I mean, just simple. I mean, you can break it down into, there's like 5 or 6 that I typically think of in terms of threats. And, just getting that information, like this could be stolen. This function could be leveraged to commit fraud. There's personally identifiable information here that we have to protect. So, things like that. And then just keep by building that into the user story, you've already kept that scope really small. And then you can think of, well, what do you do with it? Maybe you start off, the devs just have that information available. There's nothing formal that you track that they do with it, but it's there for them. They can understand it. Then you slowly build on top of that. And now maybe you start to say, all right, well, they use this information and they need to demonstrate that they created security controls for it. Or, and then maybe you go to the next step and you have some testing prioritization, and you can just slowly build on top of that. But yeah, just those little bite-sized chunks. It's that whole idea, like, the fail fast model too, right? Or even what we do with CI/CD. We're continuously integrating new things and constantly improving it.
For sure. Thank you. Sounds really great. Thanks so much for your session. So much to learn. And if anyone wants to rewatch this, it will be shared on YouTube, and I'm sure many people will. We have some roundtables coming up after this. And there's also going to be a yoga session a little later. In about an hour, in about 45 minutes, they're on track for. There will be a stretch with us session if anyone wants to stretch a bit. Thank you. Thanks, Alyssa.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alyssa. Bye-bye. See you all at the roundtables.